Hello, are we on? Good afternoon, everybody, and if you're going to be watching this, or if you're watching it live, welcome to you. It is, I've no idea what day it is. Is it Wednesday? Hang on, it's Wednesday. It's Wednesday the 22nd of April. We're on I'm on day 30 of complete and total lockdown because of the coronavirus. It's a beautiful, beautiful day. Across the field from this here caravan, the little hermitage on Fairfield Vicarage Drive, so across the field, today we are listening to soul sounds of the 70s by the sound of it. Yesterday we had the Beatles, Beatles' greatest hits, and I have to say they turn it up a bit loud, and I don't know if you can hear it in the background. If you can hear it in the background, I'm sorry if it's a bit of an intrusion or interference. Maybe you like this sort of stuff, but I'm very tempted to plug my guitar in and blast out something loud, a few power chords and stuff like that, but I don't think I should really. Or else I could alternatively put some space rock on. How about some Hawkwind Masters of the Universe or something like that, very loud for the benefit of the neighbours, just as I'm benefiting from their soul sounds of the 70s or whatever it is. Anyway, I waffle. I'm not going to fall out with my neighbours, they're all wonderful. And actually I don't mind them sounding music in people's gardens because it's a happy sound on a beautiful sunny afternoon such as we have here. A few days ago I made the suggestion that I could do some sort of online Bible study type thing as an introduction to Christianity. So on reflection, that perhaps sounds a little bit too formal. But what I think I might do over the next few weeks, and I'm going to start today, is do just a succession of videos live, but they'll be available to watch at any time really. So they're going to appear at pretty random times on my timeline on Facebook. And I thought what I would do was some sort of basic introductory stuff about Christianity and about really what it means to me and how I interpret my faith in a very complicated world where there are lots and lots of different religions and faith, and even within those different expressions of them, all vying for our attention. So it's a much more serious kind of subject that I'm approaching than yesterday's great tea festival. I am enjoying tea. There are plenty of tea bags left still, which you'll be pleased to know about. It means that I haven't drank over 1,000 cups of tea in the last few hours. I have had a few though. So what I thought I would do this afternoon is have a quick look at the Bible and how to approach it, or rather how I approach it really. And you can see on the table I've got a number of books. They're all Bibles. I'm really sorry, but this video it does everything in mirror image, and I did see something the other day about how to turn the mirror image the right way around. However, that was on an Android phone and it doesn't work on my phone, so I can't do that. So everything's a bit mirror image, and although I'm left-handed, you're watching me drinking a cup of tea in my right hand, but I'm actually, in real life, I'm holding it in my left hand. It's just how it is. What else do I need to tell you? So the Bible, what is it? I've got a few here. I'm going to come to those in a moment. But I often hear people making statements, and they're usually people who are being critical and in some way trying to assault the faith that I represent. And so I often hear people making statements such as, I've read the Bible and it's nothing but myths and a load of nonsense. And people say that sort of thing, thinking that they're being clever and thinking maybe they can just have a little go at the faith that I represent. And actually, I've been doing this Christianity thing for nearly 40 years, and there aren't many criticisms that I haven't heard. And to be honest with you, when you have a relationship with your Heavenly Father, all those criticisms, they just become like dust that blows past, and they don't stick. So it doesn't really worry me at all when people criticise my faith. But when people start to criticise the Bible, when I push back a little bit, what I find is that actually when somebody says, "Oh, I've read the Bible and it's a load of nonsense," what I usually find is that more often than not, they haven't actually read the Bible. They may have read from it, but rarely have they actually read it. And usually, though, what they have in terms of experience of the Bible is a few sort of half-remembered stories and small parts from it that perhaps go back to childhood, or else they've had possibly passages that have been pointed out to them by various people who themselves are misusing it or not understanding it properly. And some of those, I have to say, are Christian people, religious people. So, the Bible, what is it? Well, I've got a selection here. I've got 7 books on this table. They're all Bibles and they're all different. So they're all English translations of the Bible. So just a quick look at what I've got in front of me. This one is the New Revised Standard Bible. It's actually the one which is used very widely in the Church of England, and it is one of my preferred Bibles. Another favourite that many people have is the New International Version, a modern English translation that has its origins in the 1970s. There's a bookmark falling out. There's a more modern updated version of it, which I think is the revised. It gets complicated, all these initials. The revised New International Version, which is a little bit more gender inclusive and more appropriate for the era in which we live than from when this was originally released in the English language, I think in the early 1970s. Another one, again, this probably is my favourite. This is the English Standard Version. It's very, very similar to the New Revised Standard. It's an accurate translation, just like the New Revised Standard Version. But there are certain subtle differences that I won't go into now, but they do make me prefer it ever so slightly over this one, which is the standard one which we use in the Church of England. Another one I've got here, this is, it's in a leather Bible case, but I won't take it out because it's stapled in. But this is something called the Amplified Bible. It goes all the way up to 11, and it's a bit loud. And what that does is that every phrase in the Bible, it tries to unpack it in its fullest, so that you get very, very long sentences, because every word is expounded. I won't read it out because it is a bit laborious. But as a study aid, that's quite a helpful thing. This one is the old traditional King James Version or authorised version, first translated. Well, it originated from an earlier translation, but it was first came into common usage in 1611. So it was first published in 1611, and this was the default Bible that every church would have had up until the more modern ones started to come to the fore in the 19th and 20th centuries. So this is the one that most people would be familiar with the words. Well, I won't read examples out, but lots and lots of phrases from this have found their way into the English language, and I'll perhaps come to that in just a moment. This one is the Living Bible. It's a paraphrase, so rather than it being trying to translate word for word, it tries to translate thought for thought. It might be worth knowing, as I'm saying this, that the Bible was originally written in 2 main languages, so, well, 3 actually, but 2 of them were very closely related. So the Old Testament was primarily written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and the New Testament is primarily written in Greek. So when you translate from one language to another, it's very difficult to do a word-for-word translation because words have different meanings in different cultures, and there are concepts that don't communicate very well across the different languages and cultures. So a thought-for-thought translation can be quite helpful in getting to grips with what the original author intended to say. And this one, nice big sort of leather-bound thing, is the New Living Translation. This has been sitting on my bookshelf for about 10 years, and I have to say I've never actually opened it. Well, I have opened it, I've gone like that, as you do, but I've never used it or read from it, and I've not even read the preface from it, and so I don't actually know anything about it, but it just looks nice. and one day I might open it and actually start to use it. But generally speaking, I use this one or this one, the New Revised Standard, the NRSV, or the English Standard, the ESV, and they're my favourite versions of the Bible. So I also used to have a huge collection. Oops, golly, that fell over, nearly took the flowers with it. I used to have a huge collection of collectible Bibles, really old ones, some of them going back to the 1600s, and one even from the 1500s, and they were worth a fair bit of money. But I had a clear out when we moved from the old vicarage to this new one, and I sold a lot of them, and that was a good thing because that enabled me to buy another motorbike. So as you do. So the Bible. Well, firstly, despite appearances, it isn't a book. It is in the sense that it's got a cover on it on the back and the front, another bookmark falling out, and pages in between. So in that sense, it's a book. But it isn't a book in the usual way in which we understand a book. It's more of a filing cabinet. So if we think of the Bible more as a filing cabinet than a complete book, and I say that because actually the Bible is a collection of books and documents. Excuse me, slurp of tea. So the Bible's a collection, of a compilation of different books and documents. There are 66 of them in most Bibles. And there are further books and documents in some Bibles as well, which are known, and these further ones are known collectively as the Apocrypha. But the Bible, as I mostly use it, and most Reformed or Protestant Christians would use a Bible with the 66 books. And it's divided into two main sections. And these are the Old Testament, which comprises of 39 of the books, and then the New Testament, in which there are 27 books. And within these 66 books, and this is where how we use the Bible becomes really, really important, because within these 66 books there are lots and lots of different types of literature. Some of them are as follows. So there's history, there's myth, there's poetry, there's songs, there's prophecy, there's correspondence, there's biography, there's parables. Within it all there's metaphor, there's analogy, there's instruction, there's advice, and so on. And not only that, because it's a collection of different documents, it should also be noted that it spans many centuries of history. And these documents, which are contained within the covers that we know as the Bible, were written over a period of about 1500 years. So when someone says, "I've read the Bible and it's a load of nonsense," my usual response is to ask, which bit? Because clearly the whole thing is far more complicated to dismiss as nonsense. So a few thoughts on that. When we think about the way that we use language, we need to be very cautious before we dismiss something as nonsense. If I were to say to you that it's raining cats and dogs outside, thankfully it isn't, but if I were to say that to you, you would know exactly what I mean. If I were to say that same phrase to someone who has only a rudimentary understanding of our language and who comes from a completely different cultural context, it would be a totally bewildering statement, and it would be total nonsense to them. So this is a very simplistic example, but what it does is it makes clear that we can't dismiss as nonsense literature that was written in a specific context, for a specific people at a specific time in history, and we need an understanding of context before we can dismiss it so lightly. And also, from within the pages of the Bible, we need to be very careful that we don't confuse one particular genre of literature with another and try to apply the same literal interpretations. So we shouldn't, for example, treat in the same way the metaphor and analogy of the New Testament book of Revelation with, for example, the historical narrative of the historical books of 1 and 2 Chronicles by applying the same technique of literal interpretation. You simply cannot do it because they are different genres of literature and they require a different approach. And there's a lot in the Bible that isn't intended to be understood literally. Fleas are biting. Not really. A parable, for example, a parable in the Bible. A parable is a story. It may or it may not be a true story, but nevertheless it is still a vehicle for teaching an important truth. We've all heard of Aesop's fables, haven't we? They're not biblical, of course, but the principle applies. Aesop's fables, and what they are is they are examples of stories that convey an important message. The tortoise never raced the hare, but the message of the story is a truth. And there are many passages in the Bible that could be said to do the same things, and we can't dismiss such stories so easily because the message that they carry is profound and it's important. More about the Bible. The 66 books of the Bible were written by numerous different authors, all human beings, of course, with all the flaws and foibles, that's a good word, foibles, of our common humanity. And I don't believe, as some would try to convey, that the Bible was essentially dictated by God and that people wrote down what God inspired them to write. A lot of it is inspired and it's wonderful, but there are also a lot of horrific, barbaric and blood-soaked events in the Bible, which I can't for a moment believe can be attributed to God. What I believe them to be is the narrative of what was a specific group of people connected by common ancestors, carving out a sense of identity as a nation within the context of a violent and a competitive world. Their victories were attributed to God's blessing, and their defeats were attributed to when they believed they had displeased him. And these accounts were written down to demonstrate that if you did things right, things went well, and if you didn't do things right, things went badly, and either way God was the controlling factor. And this is how much of the Old Testament presents itself. But of course we know that life is far more complicated than that, and we see this expressed in, for example, the Old Testament book of Job. So that's a little bit about the Old Testament. What about the New Testament, the last 27 books or documents of the Bible? Well, this is where it starts to get really interesting, because within the New Testament we see a far clearer picture of the nature of God, of the way he reveals himself to humanity and his purpose for our lives. And these things are only hinted at throughout the Old Testament, but they are much more fully and clearly laid out and expressed in the New Testament. And the starting point for all of this is the person of Jesus Christ. So what we have in the New Testament, we have the 4 Gospels, which are accounts of Jesus' life, his teaching and his death and resurrection, and his identity, and they speak to us of his uniqueness and all the rest of it. And this is followed by the historical narrative of the Acts of the Apostles, which outline some of the developments and the growth of the early church. And then after this we have a number of letters which are addressed to churches and individuals. They give instruction in theology, what we should believe as Christians, and of practical matters in church life and personal life, the way that we should live as Christians. So these are all addressed in the letters of the New Testament. And finally we have the book of Revelation, which is primarily a genre of literature which is fairly unique to the people of the Middle East of that era, and it's known as apocalyptic, and it mostly uses metaphor and analogy to convey something of the mystery of God and of heaven and earth, and it's very difficult to grapple with and understand. But nevertheless, in a nutshell, that's a bit about the Bible. Much more important than talking about it, though, and criticism or otherwise of it, is actually the reading of it. So hopefully, armed with a little bit of the knowledge that I've tried to convey, I would like to encourage you really to try to read from it. So firstly, here's a few tips. It's far more accessible to read in a modern English version than in the old, outdated language of the 16th and 17th centuries. As beautiful as that language is, it's difficult to understand for many people without spending a lot of effort and time on it. So that's the King James or Authorised version, as it's often known. So read it in a modern version. I use the English Standard Version, as I said, or the New Revised Standard Version. There are plenty of others, and in fact, if you go online, you can download them. It take quite a lot of paper if you were to print them off, but you can read them online, and you can find them on reading devices and so on. So buy one. I prefer a hard copy. A hard copy of the Bible is a nice thing to hold, and there's something about sitting reading from a real life book. And secondly, when it comes to reading the Bible, start with the life of Jesus. Rather than starting right at the beginning, if you just open it and start at the first book of the Bible, you come to the book of Genesis, and it's all fascinating stuff. We read about the creation, we read about the fall, we read about the flood and all the rest of it, and then we start moving into some historical stuff relating to the Abraham and the fathers of the faith, and then we come to the end of that and we get to Exodus, which talks about Moses and all the rest of it, and then suddenly halfway through Exodus we're into all this stuff where God's giving the law and all the rest of it, and the people are interpreting it, and it becomes very heavy going. And after that you're into another book, Leviticus I think it is, or it might be Deuteronomy, and it really does get difficult, and it's like swimming through treacle. And most people, they'll get through Genesis to get part way into Exodus, and they give up on reading the Bible. They think, that's too hard, I can't do that. And they put it back on the bookshelf, and that's it really for a few years. So if you're going to start reading the Bible, I would strongly suggest that you start in the New Testament. Start reading about the life of Jesus in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke or John. They're all telling us about the life of Jesus from the perspective of different authors, and it wouldn't hurt to read all four, even though some of what you read will be duplicated across some of the Gospels, so you'll be reading it more than once. But read about the life of Jesus if you're going to start reading the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke or John, and then maybe you could move on to the Psalms, or you could move on to some of the letters of the New Testament, whatever. But get to grips with the life of Jesus if you want a full understanding of how God seeks to reveal himself to the world and to individual human beings, and draws into a relationship with himself. And then the other thing that I would suggest before you read the Bible is actually approach it with an open mind. Take your time, absorb what it says. When you read a passage, put yourself into that position and try and imagine yourself present where the events that you're reading about are taking place. And also spend a moment before you read. You might feel daft praying, but that's okay. It doesn't matter if you feel a bit daft, but you can still pray. Ask God to speak to you through the words of the Scriptures. And I really believe that if you're open-hearted, you will gain a growing awareness of God's love expressed to us through his Son Jesus Christ as you read about his life. And I think that's it really. I'm aware that some Christians wouldn't be comfortable with some aspects of my approach to the Bible, and they may consider me to be a little bit too liberal, because I don't accept a totally literal interpretation of what it has to say to us. But nevertheless, I do believe that God speaks to us through it, so I'm not troubled at all by anybody's criticism of the way I approach faith and the Bible and all the rest of it. And what I really don't want on this Facebook video page are lots of theological arguments arising in the comments. And the reason I don't want that, so this is a little note to any Christians who might wish to pop up and say something about what I've said. Please don't feel tempted to open up a theological discussion or argument. And the reason I don't want that to happen is because I'm actually trying to engage people and stimulate interest in the faith rather than putting people off. And one of the things that puts people off is the fact that Christians are very prone to falling out with each other over different theological perspectives on things, and it's not helpful for anybody who looks in from the outside. The Bible actually says, and we need to learn from this as Christians, that by their love for one another the world will know that we are Christ's disciples. So is that it? It probably is it, really. So to everybody out there who might be watching this live or who might come into it a little bit later on, take care and God bless, and remember of all things that you are unique and you are precious and you are loved. You can read about that love in the pages of the New Testament of the Bible. Take care and God bless. Bye for now.